Good afternoon, Michael Malice here. Let that be your welcome for the next hour. And here for my very first episode on Podcast One, I am very excited to bring Dr. Debra Soh, author of The End of Gender, and someone who I absolutely love talking to. And the thing I love about talking to you, Doc, is that in every other interview I see, you always have this kind of very austere, serious vibe to you. But I've known you, we've talked a bit off camera. There is this kind of sweet dork underneath, which I don't think people get to see that much. So let me ask you this. My idol of all time is Camille Paglia, and I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with her work. She's kind of this renegade feminist. And one of the things she talks about is sexual personae and how men and women play into different archetypes, both in the bedroom and the boardroom, in their professional life. Is that something, as a woman who discusses things like sexuality and is a sex researcher, is that something that you have to pay attention to in how you discuss these issues?
Oh, yeah. Well, first, let me say thank you so much for having me on. It's so great to talk to you again. I really appreciate that you came on my podcast a couple of weeks ago. It's an honor to be your first guest on Podcast One. And I think it's funny that you did notice that. I for myself, I would say probably what people see of me is more serious of a person than I am in real life, like my friends and family who know me, just because of the issues I do talk about publicly, things like gender transition in children, things like the differences between trans women and women who are born women. I mean, these are contentious issues, and I feel like it's not really appropriate for me to show up and be laughing and joking about it, because I do take the things I talk about with a lot of responsibility. So, but yeah, I would definitely say, I mean, when I get to talk to people like you, or if I do other comedians shows, people are always like, oh my God, she actually smiles. Yeah. Oh, wow, she has a personality. But regarding your question, I mean, I have a whole chapter in The End of Gender about differences between men and women when it comes to dating and courtship. There definitely are, on average, differences between men and women in terms of how they pursue sex and dating. And I think to ignore those differences is futile and foolish, because it doesn't end up serving you in the end. And that's not to say all men are the same and all women are the same. Of course, there are some people who are different, don't fit into that pattern. But for myself, it definitely, I think, is something that I have had to think about, because coming from a background in sex research, I'm very proud of having been a sex researcher. But unfortunately, I think sex science, human sexuality, the study of human sexuality, is not taken as seriously as it should be taken. And I think people also have all these weird assumptions about you as a person when you do sex research. And I think to some extent, I don't like to talk about sexism or misogyny too much, because I do think as a woman, I'm very fortunate. I don't feel like that's something in the Western world that we necessarily have to deal with as much. But I do think sometimes as a woman, there's also this tendency for people to assume things about you when you do talk openly about sex. So I like that question.
Yeah, it's kind of a parallel to people who are libertarians who want to legalize drugs, and then the knock against them is like, oh, you just want to sit at home and smoke weed all the time. Or if someone wants to, let's suppose, argue for legalizing sex work, because it's like, look, these women need to have recourse to the police, because if they don't, they're going to be the targets of violent crime and or murder, with having no possibility to ask somebody for help. So do you get the thing, oh, you want to talk about this because you're some kind of pervert or something like that? Is that the assumption that people get?
Usually, or because one of my areas of expertise when I was in academia doing research is paraphilias. So that's unusual sexual interests, basically kinky sex. And I always tell people I'm very vanilla, I'm very traditional, I'm monogamous when I'm dating somebody. Whether or not they believe me or not is a different thing. But I feel like I do say that, well, because kinky sex is stigmatized, and I advocate for removing the stigma around it. As long as what you're doing in the bedroom is consensual, I don't think it's anyone's place to judge you. But I also don't want it to ever come across like I'm speaking for that community. Just as I feel it's important whenever I talk about trans issues and the fights I get into with trans activists, I always say that I'm not transgender. Not that I think there's anything wrong with it. Obviously, I fully support transgender people, but I just don't ever want to seem like I'm speaking for the community. So the same thing with kinky sex. I think people assume when you're a sex researcher, you must be really promiscuous, or you must have some personal reason for doing it, or there might be something wrong with you, and that's why you find this interesting. But for me, I feel it's interesting. It's fascinating. There's no end to the number of questions that are out there. And especially because it is an area that is so taboo, there's so much that could be done and so much that needs to be needs to be done that, sex researchers are still fighting for.
Do you think Freud has on net had a positive or negative impact in this area? Because, for those who, I mean, it's pretty common knowledge, but when Freud came out and started over a century ago discussing sexuality and how it develops in children, this was considered a huge taboo. This was a huge, shocking conversation to have. Now there is kind of understanding, okay, well, we don't really know how sexuality develops. There was a big argument about gay rights and that, gay people are insisting they're born gay, but we don't even really know, and please correct me if I'm wrong, how people become straight. We don't know how sexuality develops and what the mechanisms are. So what do you think about Freud's impact on this field?
I would say the positive aspect is that it opens up a discussion at least. But from a scientific expert, I mean, a scientific perspective, because I always want to come at it from an evidence-based perspective, there isn't really any evidence to back up those ideas. So in that way, I think it is what it is. And I think people tend to latch on to things that they might see as somehow explaining their own experiences in life. So I understand that. But again, I think there's so much that is going on in the field of sex research that's really fascinating that people should they should be paying attention to. And I think with further dissemination of research, and I think that is getting better in terms of the way that news is covering these issues. I do think they're a little bit more open to talking about sexuality. Although what we see now instead is, so an area that I talk and write about a lot is how left-wing activism is now destroying the field and bending it to a particular narrative. Because it used to be, why are these people wanting to study sex? They must be depraved, they must be disturbed, or why are we wasting money funding these studies? And now the politicization or the interference is coming from the far left saying, okay, we're going to take these studies findings and either misrepresent them or warp them to fit our agenda with regard to sexual orientation. So there is actually research to show that sexual orientation is biological. One of the chapters in my book, I talk about this. And so it has to do with exposure to testosterone in the womb. So higher levels of exposure to testosterone is associated with sexual interest in women. But so that's regardless of whether someone is male or female. So you'll see that with straight men, and you also see that with lesbian women. When it comes to the issue of trans and how this plays out, because there is a differentiation in terms of, say, individuals born male who identify as female. And I always want to emphasize I support transitioning in adults. I'm critical of transitioning in children because the research does not back that up as the best treatment pathway for these kids. But when it comes to there's a difference there in terms of whether someone is, so with trans women who are attracted to men versus women, there's a difference in terms of the etiology. There's a difference in terms of what the best treatment for them is going to be. And also in terms of, say something like bisexuality. People will often use that term to self-identify, but it can mean a lot of different things, depending on what it is that they find attractive, what it is they're fantasizing about.
Yeah, I think the concern, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what J.K. Rowling said, is that when someone is a child and they're like an effeminate boy or they're a masculine girl, like a tomboy or something like that, they are not going to have the cognitive knowledge or life experience to know the difference between I identify as the other gender as opposed to I'm displaying characteristics of their gender, but I'm still, the gender that I am. So what she's talking about is, look, if you have a little boy who's a sissy, and you're just going to start pumping him with hormones at a young age, it could just mean that he's an effeminate gay male. It doesn't mean that he's at all a transgender woman. And we're seeing this happen, as I'm sure you know in your work, in Iran. Tehran is the world sex capital, the world sex change capital, because any men there who want to sleep with other men, they force them to undergo gender reassigned surgery and therefore in effect make them straight.
Yeah, this is one really sad aspect that I'm glad to see that it's being talked about more so now. Definitely, I'd say when I was in sex research, we were all saying this is the new conversion therapy, because you take children who are gender atypical, that is associated with being gay in adulthood. So if you have little boys who are more like girls or little girls who are more like boys, that's associated with being gay when they grow up. So now instead, if you have a child who says that they are the opposite sex, now the adults in their lives think that this means that the child actually is the opposite sex and that they should transition, when I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous, because in many cases, this is the only language that children have to express that they want to do things that the other sex does. And especially if their parents or adults say to them, oh, you can't do this thing because, say if it's a little boy, oh, only girls do that thing. Well, of course, the little boy is going to then say, well, I must be a girl. And I mean, I even have people, gay adults reaching out to me. And it really touches me so much when I get these messages, especially from gay men who said to me, they were thinking about transitioning at some point, but they happened to read an article I wrote, or they saw me in an interview, and they decided to wait. And now they are a bit older and they've come out as gay. And they say to me, I thought because I was attracted, or I am attracted to men, and that I like doing things that girls do, that must mean I'm actually a woman. And I also felt to some extent, they'll say to me that being a woman would be an easier life for them, which I think is really horrible. I mean, why are we not talking about acceptance for gay people as well? I do believe that trans people face discrimination. I do think transphobia is real, but I also think it's important to advocate for gay people. I grew up in the gay community, and so, it's something I'm also very proud about. And it just makes me very sad to see what's happening right now. But I also don't blame the parents to some extent, because they're being manipulated in some cases by the medical professionals, by these activist organizations, into really believing this is the only path forward for their kids.
Yeah, it seems to be an enormous, there's the big criticism against like social conservatives, like, oh, you want us to go back to the 50s, but this is the same exact thing, because for decades, gay men who were kind of effeminate had to argue, no, I'm attracted to men, but I'm still fully a man. There's no part of me that thinks I'm a woman. And they're being told, you're really a girl, you're really a girl, really a girl. And now they're being told this by people to their left, that no, you are actually a girl who's attracted to men. And especially when someone is dealing with atypical behaviors regarding gender, regarding sexuality, it's going to be confusing for everyone. So when you start getting into things like surgery and hormones, and that's another whole other issue. Like, everyone understands if women are pregnant or if men take steroids, which are testosterone, this is going to affect their psychology to an enormous extent.
Not women, bodies with vaginas, Michael.
Okay, thank you, doctor. Thank you for the correction.
Totally kidding.
Yeah, thank you for the correction. But it's very well understood that when people have high levels of certain hormones, it's going to affect their psychology. So if someone is undergoing in a state of flux or about their identity, to add hormones to that situation, it's not at all a given, although I'm sure it helps some people, that this is going to basically calm their mental turmoil and make them feel relaxed.
Well, there's often a lot of comorbidity that goes along with, especially nowadays, with gender dysphoria, because gender is this hot topic, trendy thing. So everyone is jumping on the gender bandwagon. And so when someone is upset about something in their life, even if they go into therapy to talk to a mental health practitioner, many of them will view everything through the lens of gender now. So if you're sad, if you're struggling with something, if you're uncomfortable with your body, that's seen as somehow related to gender, which in some cases is just a natural part of life, especially when it comes to teenagers who are going through puberty, especially for young girls. So another area I talk a lot about is rapid-onset gender dysphoria, this phenomenon of young women who are very suddenly coming out as transgender and wanting to undergo hormonal treatment, in some cases getting a double mastectomy very quickly. And for many of them, it's just a natural part of going through puberty. They're uncomfortable with having a female figure, developing breasts, suddenly getting sexualized, being sexualized by society, not being comfortable with that. And no one is saying to them, that's a very normal part of being a young woman. Unfortunately, it doesn't make it okay. But let's talk about that, and let's talk about how we can work and fight against that, instead of saying, okay, yeah, you really are a man, so you should transition. And also, in terms of comorbidity, autism is another mental health condition that you'll commonly see among these young women. And again, I obviously have no issue. I think people with autism deserve love and respect, and I don't think people with autism deserve any sort of stigma. But this fear that activists have about labeling anything as atypical, like mentally different or a mental health condition, is partially why they've tried to really push for transitioning not being related to gender dysphoria. And also, I think why they really don't want to associate gender dysphoria or transition with other mental health conditions, because in the past, it's been very common for people to dismiss transgender people as this is on your head, right? And that's why they should not be allowed to transition, which I don't agree with. But there needs to be more nuance to this conversation. And the biggest thing is professional. I don't do clinical work anymore, but I would say mental health professionals need to be able to do this work and ask the right questions with their patients and not feel afraid. And that's very much what you see now with pretty much everyone I know. They are terrified. They either don't want to do this work if they're an ethical practicing clinician, or they feel they have to go along with it.
This sounds to me, from what I'm hearing, and please correct me because I'm obviously coming from a place of ignorance. When I was growing up, it was extremely common for young women, teenager to early 20s, to have some sort of eating disorder, anorexia or bulimia. And what they had to argue for a lot of time in the public consciousness is this isn't really about food. This isn't really about your body per se. This is about control and feeling a loss of control about your circumstances or about the body itself. And the eating is almost secondary. And it seems like this, what you're describing as early onset gender dysphoria, or if I said the term correctly, is just a shift from, having an eating disorder and having these kind of body issues to basically something that's just adjacent to it and the same phenomenon in different form.
Yeah, I think there definitely are parallels, but unfortunately, researchers are not going to be able to study this objectively because this the climate we're in right now. That sort of a study would never get funded. And even if it did happen, there's no way it would get published. And if it did get published, it would get pulled and have all sorts of corrections forced on the authors if it was even allowed to be published. It probably would just be retracted outright. So it would not happen in today's climate, which is really unfortunate because in the end, it is the people who are struggling with this that are going to suffer from that lack of information. But I do think, for life is hard, and especially for young people, like this segment of individuals who are going through this. I wish that we could be having a more honest conversation to say to them, what you're going through is really unfortunate. In many cases, there's a history of trauma as well.
Yeah.
In many cases, it's also young women who are lesbian, but they're not fully comfortable with being attracted to girls. So they think, well, if I transition to male and I'm a man who's attracted to girls or to women, then that's more socially acceptable.
I feel like this question is going to trigger you, not in a bad way, but in a way that's going to give you, like, you're going to start going off for 20 minutes. I recently read a book called Testosterone Rex. Have you read it?
I have not read it, but I know of it.
Yes. Here we go. Good. So this book was very lauded. And from the description was completely incorrect. The description made it sound as if the author is claiming that testosterone is not, important in terms of development of gender, or in terms of development of the individual, and that the only reason men bench press more than women is because they've been socialized. She does not make that claim. The claim she does make, however, is that this evolutionary psychology idea, which I'm curious you subscribe to, the idea is that you need one man, and you need men are less valuable than women, right? The man wants to be as promiscuous as possible because the cost of donating sperm is very little, whereas the woman wants to be as discriminatory as possible because the cost of her for bearing a child is extraordinarily high. She's got 9 months and she's got to raise the kid. So that creates an asymmetry historically and naturally, that the men are the hunters and the women are the hunted. And that plays out in terms of gender roles and dating. She kind of says that that's overblown, and that really it's both things happen to that men are much choosier than we like to think, and that women are much more promiscuous and for biological reasons than we'd like to think. What do you think about that whole argument? And basically that whole premise about you don't want one key, you want one key that opens a lot of locks, but you want that one lock that can only be opened by one key.
I would probably have to actually read the book to really speak to the criticisms, but I would say just more broadly in terms of the denial I see around biological sex differences, particularly in the brain, or differences between men and women that are based in evolutionary psychology or evolutionary biology. I understand why people find them threatening, and I'll try not to make this a 20-minute rant.
No, please.
I understand why people find it threatening because, there are, some people out there will take these explanations to denigrate women and say that women are inferior, we're not as competent, we don't belong in disciplines like STEM, or there's I talk in the book about just internet culture and how some people will use these explanations as a justification to treat women poorly. And I always try to be as clear as possible that when I say these things, I'm not giving evidence, or I'm not supporting these really misogynistic views of women. But to deny that these differences exist does a disservice, I think, to gender equality, because I think most people know that it's true. This information is true. So then when you just claim that it doesn't exist or it's not factual, people don't take you seriously. So they don't even care about whatever the aspects of your argument are. When you're saying it's important for us to care about gender equality, they just think this person has no idea what they're talking about. So why should I listen to them? And then it also doesn't speak to the fact that there are these people who are using it for their negative, whatever views they have on women. You can't even engage at that level in terms of the conversation if you're pretending that none of these differences matter. And I think it does a disservice in the end of the day when it comes to actual dating, how this plays out, because I hear what inspired that chapter in my book is all the young women who would reach out to me saying, I see my friends sleeping around, or I'm trying to do this. I'm not happy. I don't know, is there something wrong with me? I would get a lot of young women saying that they don't understand why they don't approach sex in the same way that their boyfriends or male partners do if they're straight, and that men can get aroused very quickly, whereas women, it takes a little bit longer. There's a bit more of a disconnect between psychologically and physically being aroused if you're a woman. So when you know these things, this can help you in the bedroom. And then to just pretend that none of this matters, I think that's a really short-sighted way to view it. But I think also, people are very quick to also look at specific cases of, oh, I know this person who's like this, or I'm like this, so how can you say? But again, I mean, we're talking about averages, and you can't pretend that millions of years of evolution just suddenly don't matter because you don't want it to matter.
It's amazing how people don't understand, to a large extent, like I'd say a good 40% of the population don't understand that the expression tends to. So if I say, for example, men tend to be taller than women, I've had people reply, I know a girl who's 6'3", which is just fascinating to me, as if I live in a universe where I've never encountered a tall woman. And and when you try to reverse engineer the thought process, they literally think you're saying all men are taller than all women, which is something so absurd on its face. But this is how they process data. And then you realize there's no real conversation to be had. Here is the question I know everyone's going to be very excited for me to ask you. You talked earlier about autism. You talked about trans issues and aberrant sexuality. Have you been following the Chris Chan story?
No, what is that?
Oh, basically, Chris Chan was a severely autistic internet personality who developed a character that's a mix of Pikachu and Sonic called Sonichu. He came out as transgender. She came out as transgender. At one point, she had a wound in a certain part of her body, which she perceived as God giving her a female anatomy. And she was recently trolled by the internet into having relations with her senile mother, and is now in prison for this. And there's questions about which kind of prison, male or female, she's going to be put into. So there's like 2-hour internet documentaries about this, which I think would be absolutely the worst possible use of your time. But since many of my listeners have nothing to do, I'm sure they're going to follow that rabbit hole. So I apologize to you for going down that question.
No, this is a good question. I'm amazed I haven't heard about this. I would say there's a number of things I could say with regard to the prison aspect. I mean, this is one issue that just blows my mind. The fact that you will have, and so I don't really know too much about this. Christian or Chris Chan?
Chris Chan, as it like 4chan, Chris Chan.
Okay, so I don't know about this particular individual per se.
Wait,
but
can you look them up on your computer in front of us? Can you Google Chris Chan to see the picture? Because I want to see everyone's. Debra Soh reacts to looking up Chris Chan.
Let me see.
Yeah.
Let's see how the right thing comes up when.
Let's see how serious her face remains when she looks at this. It'll be like the Nazis looking into the Ark of the Covenant at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Okay. I think this is the person.
Yeah, I think you'd know.
Okay. Well. Okay. So.
Okay, good. Moving on. You were saying about prison, though, in all seriousness.
So prison, yeah.
Keep it together, Debra. You're on camera. Keep it together. You're a doctor. You're a professional. You're an author.
Like sneeze. So, what I would say about prison is it blows my mind the fact that you will have in some cases individuals who were arrested as male
Yeah.
For a sex offense, or in some cases they have a history of multiple sexual offenses, and then they are put in prison and they suddenly identify as female and they're actually put into the women's prison. And I'm thinking, what are these people thinking? I mean, are they thinking? I've worked with sex offenders in the past, both clinically and in research, and you know that sex offenders, I mean, they're just trying to get access to victims. That's basically their life mission. So why would you give them another, basically a free pass? I don't know. I mean, I don't know if people are just overly empathetic to the whole issue of gender dysphoria, or if they're afraid of the backlash from activists, but it just that alone speaks to where we are culturally in terms of how crazy this is.
How do you personally handle it if you're talking to someone who is a known or established like sexual assailant, and knowing when they're talking to you that, you know, if this person had their druthers, you know, if I was in an alley somewhere, this person would be assaulting me right now. Like, how do you kind of keep your composure or have a conversation with something like that? Because most of us will never encounter someone, at least to our knowledge, who is that level of evil.
If you were to encounter someone who is a sexual offender.
Yeah.
Sorry, I feel like I missed a part of what you were saying.
No, because you were saying like in your work, you used to kind of interview people like this, right? So like, how do you handle it on a personal level? Like trying to have like me and you, we could pal around, we can joke, and they're not like, it's not like the person has horns. They don't have a tail or a pitchfork. They look like you and me. They look like a normal person, but knowing that this is what they have done, and knowing if they had their opportunity, they would be doing this again, possibly to you. How do you as a female just sit and have this conversation with them?
Oh, I see what you're saying. I think I'm still like settling down from the earlier part of this conversation. I would just, I mean, it's work, so I would just try to be as professional as possible. But definitely there was a whole, I mean, I've never really talked about this, but there's a whole bunch of things that you learn in terms of how to physically protect yourself and what you look out for. And I've always just been very good at reading people, so I think that's part of it in terms of how I was able to keep myself physically safe. But I mean, my reason for wanting to do that work was to help society, or to understand this behavior, to do something good for society. And it's very difficult work. And I have so much respect for people who work in the field of forensics, because it takes a lot out of you emotionally. I would say we talked a bit about this when you were on my podcast, in terms of just how it affects you. Even if you try to keep your professional life completely separate from your personal life, it can't help but bleed over a little bit if you're a human being and you experience emotions, which, contrary to what probably a lot of people think, I'm not a robot, I am a human being. So I do feel, you know, when you hear about these cases, especially when you read the case reports, in some cases it's very, very graphic, and but on the same time, I think it has helped me in a way, because I'm able to look at issues, whatever it is, very, very logically and rationally, to take the emotional aspect out of it, and also to, I think, also deal with angry trolls on social media, because to me, that's nothing in the grand scheme of life in terms of what's out there. You definitely become less desensitized to a lot of things after doing that type of work, which I do think has helped me in some ways.
What do you think is the biggest mistake that young men are making nowadays when it comes to, you know, trying to mate, or, you know, kind of, because there's so much confusion about gender, and I'm sure in your research you've encountered things that, like, things people are doing that are wrong, and I suppose things they're doing that do end up facilitating male-female attraction. So, like, do you have any kind of like professional advice to young men?
I would say to be a gentleman, number one. I feel young men nowadays feel this pressure they're so afraid of offending their date. I think it's good to be sensitive, of course, don't be rude. But I say in my book, if a woman's going to be offended by you holding the door, holding the chair, or pulling the chair out for her, things like that, then that's probably not the right person for you. And I'm sure there'll be other things that would come up later on, because there's no reason for someone to get offended over something like that. It's one thing to say that it's really not necessary, but I think any woman should view that as a kind gesture. It's not patronizing that someone wants to do something nice for you. And what else would I say? Yeah, and just to don't feel bad about pursuing someone. And I understand in today's society, post Me Too, that men are terrified of this, but women do still like the chase. And I think there's a balance there, which is one thing I feel was really unfortunate about Me Too. I do think there was a net positive. I mean, I was very critical of Me Too when it was definitely in the height. We were at the height of it, because it just seemed that, again, it's like so many issues. You can either be on one side or the other side, and it's very difficult to say, well, there are some good things here, but there are also some bad things, because you're immediately seen as evil. And I don't think it's helpful to just say that men across the board are sexual predators and they're all terrible, and without saying, okay, there are some men like that, but most men are not like that. And how can we come away from this discussion with something that's ultimately going to be beneficial to both sexes? Because at the end of the day, if you're straight, you're going to have to interact. We're going to have to interact with each other. We're going to be dating with each other. And it's not helpful if say women come away from this thinking that men are all predators, and men come away with thinking, oh, if I do the wrong thing, I'm going to end up, my life could be ruined for this. So yeah, I think just my general advice would be, if you're going to ask someone else, ask once and that's it. Women, if you're not interested, tell a man you're not interested. Don't make it about something else. Like, I think women, we often feel we don't want to offend someone, understandably, because in many cases that comes from fear, especially, you don't know how someone's going to respond or retaliate potentially. But I think that in some cases can be part of this confusing dynamic. If a woman is saying, oh, I'm busy right now, or I have a boyfriend or whatever, because then the man comes away from it saying, okay, well, now it's not the right time, but I'll try again later.
As someone who's working to kind of destigmatize kind of unusual sexual practices in the bedroom, obviously you're 100%, there has to be consent, has to be something that both parties can appreciate, and so on and so forth. One of the big arguments that traditional conservatives are making nowadays is that the prevalence of pornography and the increasing consumption of pornography has led young men especially to have very unrealistic expectations of women in the bedroom, and that it's also opening doors in terms of things like incest porn, getting people trying to push the envelope further and further to the point where if they're having a regular intimate relationship with their girlfriend, they just feel bored because it's too vanilla. Do you think this is a fair criticism of the pornography industry?
No, I don't think so. And it's interesting because you see this not just on the right, you see it on the left too, in terms of, say, radical feminists or radical feminism. So I think pornography is an easy topic to criticize because it has to do with human sexuality. So that is the salient thing, or that's the thing that people tend to jump on. But it's more often, I would say, a reflection of, I mean, it's difficult for me to say for every individual person, but if someone has negative views about women or unrealistic standards, I think it has more to do with that individual's views about women as is, and it just happens to manifest through pornography. I understand the concern, because I do think today's pornography is very different from pornography of decades past. And it's just, in some cases, it is very extreme, not just in terms of the sex acts, but also in terms of what people look like or what the expectations are. But I do think if young people especially have proper sex education and understand that pornography is not real life, that would help to mitigate a lot of these issues. But we don't have those conversations so much. And I understand why it's uncomfortable for parents, but I think it's very easy for people on both sides to just blame pornography for whatever issues that they're seeing. Or also, I would say this conversation about violence in the bedroom, I've been hearing a lot about that. I think that's very disturbing.
Can you expound on that? What do you mean?
Well, just young women saying that they will have male partners who are, spitting on them, calling them names, choking them, thinking that that's pleasant. Some people, I mean, if they're into BDSM, might enjoy that, but that's something that you have a discussion about with your partner, and you have to detail boundaries. You don't just spring it on someone, especially not the first time you're together.
Oh my
So I've
gosh,
been
that's
hearing a lot of
horrifying.
stories
Okay.
like, yeah, I've been hearing a lot of stories about that. But the thing is, I don't think it's pornography's fault. I think it's that these individuals who think that this is how you should treat a woman the first time you're alone with her, probably have some negative views of women as is. And so that's what we should be talking about, as opposed to saying, oh, it's porn.
Yeah, but I think, like, for example, most people that you ask them how they think policemen are or how the military or war is, they're going to point to a movie. Like, if people genuinely think like Lord of the Flies is history and not a novel, or they think Black Panther is a documentary, right? So if you're a young man who has very little sexual experience, and your entirety of sexual experience is watching it on a screen and seeing a woman who's enjoying these sort of things, can you see how he would get the idea that this is what
Oh,
healthy sexuality is?
yeah, definitely. I mean, in that, if it's someone who's watching it and who genuinely thinks this is what women likes, if he's new and into the arena and is figuring things out, I don't so much blame him. I blame the lack of sex education in that
Okay.
case, and I blame why haven't his parents had a conversation with him in terms of what to expect when you get there. That's a bit different. Well, I mean, and in that case, if a female partner says, no, I don't like it. And I also advocate for young women to say, if you don't like something, say you don't like it, and
Yes.
don't go along with it. And don't feel like you have to say, you don't feel like you have to go along with something to please your partner. I think it's different if you're in a long-term relationship and you know each other really well and you have an understanding, you can be a bit more open-minded in that case. But if it's definitely something new, no, your physical safety is the most important thing. And I feel for young women who, because I understand where they're coming from. I think in many cases, young women feel the need to please their male partners in a way that men may not feel that pressure. In some cases, like we mentioned earlier, or I mentioned earlier, in some cases, I think young women might even be afraid or feel a bit coerced. And so more broadly, I would say just for young people who are getting into this. So that's why I think you should probably know someone decently well before you get involved with them sexually, because it's such an intimate thing.
Yeah.
You are putting yourself physically in a very vulnerable place, especially for women. And I mean, if you're into casual sex, that's your business. And I say, whatever floats your boat. But these are things to think about also, because I think that would help prevent a lot of the unfortunate things that we've been seeing.
And you're also putting yourself in a very vulnerable place emotionally, which I think is something for both men and women that's kind of swept under the rug. And I think both genders are taught that you're supposed to enjoy casual sex, not think much of it. And I think it's very hard for almost everybody to kind of have that lifestyle and not for example, I had a friend who used to clean up on Tinder. Now he's kind of obese, so he's not doing so hot. And I'm sure he's listening. So yeah, I'm talking about you. And I asked him, I go, listen, if you're sleeping with all these girls and you never see them again, doesn't that get lonely? And he's like, yeah, it's like really hard because you share this intimate moment. You had a night together having conversation, and then you never see them again. On some level, your brain is going to tell you there must be something wrong with me, either the performance or me as a person, if they just have no interest in talking to me again. And if you run that experiment enough times and you get the same result, it's telling you something.
That's interesting, because you don't really hear so much of that side of it with men in terms of casual sex, in terms of getting emotionally attached. Because definitely, I would say on average, women are more likely to get attached and men are more
Sure.
likely to have a great time and not feel that attachment afterwards. But I think, that's a useful part of the conversation also, to say for men, it it might seem like a really fun time, but it may not be for everybody.
How would you encourage healthier sex education and having people have a healthier understanding of these issues? Like what age? Like how? I mean, this is such a taboo topic. Like how would you navigate it?
It would definitely need to be age appropriate. And whenever I hear people criticizing sex ed curriculum, I try to go and actually look at it myself, because sometimes people will claim, oh, they're teaching kids all sorts of inappropriate things. But then when you actually look at it in the context in which they're teaching it, it is actually just about trying to prevent sexual abuse, which I think is very important. This is what we talked about when you came
Yeah.
on my show. Very, very important, just to help kids identify what is appropriate, not appropriate, how to talk about something if it has happened to them. Um, I mean, this topic is so fraught. I would say definitely it has to be science-based, which is very difficult because anything that has to do with human sexuality or gender has just been totally taken. The activists have completely they're trying to destroy any sort of factual inquiry into these topics, and it's just about their particular agenda. I mean, you have all this weird gender ideology in sex ed curriculum. So ideally, I would say it would have to be, I mean, consent is a huge topic. I think it's good that in many places consent is being discussed. I guess, well, how much time do we have in this podcast? I don't want to take up the entire
No, this is very important stuff. Yeah.
I would just say legitimate experts in the field, scientific experts in the field should be the ones being consulted about at what age certain aspects of knowledge are appropriate. I do understand parents who are concerned, who are saying, you know, why are kids being taught about anal sex, or why are they being taught about X, Y, Z? But the other thing is research has shown that comprehensive sex ed, so sex ed that is not abstinence only education, actually leads young people to make better decisions when they do become sexually active. So they're more likely to use contraception and to also delay sexual activity. So they'll start having sex at a later age, which I think is a good thing. So it's not that sex ed puts these ideas into kids' heads and it's giving them ideas about things to do, because I'm sure, I mean, I remember most kids, even just as they're getting into puberty, a lot of them are already starting to experiment. So it's not, in many cases, parents, if you think that your kid is not curious about this stuff, I mean, they are. And especially with, so one thing I am critical about pornography, or one aspect of it, is the fact that young children are using this as sex education, and increasingly younger ages. I mean, in some cases, studies have shown younger than 10.
Oh my God.
And it's, I can't imagine if that is the first time you're encountering, like today's pornography, if that's the first time you are encountering any sort of ideas about sex, and that's what you think sex is going to be like, that I think can be, we don't know what the long-term effects are at this point, but I don't imagine it's good for development. So in that way, I understand the concern.
Okay, given your profession, I got a question I'm sure no one's ever asked you, and I'm very curious to hear your answer, because there's no way this is what you wanted to have happen. What did little Debbie want to do when she grew up? Because she didn't know I want to be a sex researcher and author. So
no, what did I want to? I actually wanted to be an architect.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how did that fall away, and how did you fall into this career path? Because this is a very unusual one, of course.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I wanted to be an architect, and I also wanted to be a writer.
Okay.
And I actually remember it was crazy because
wait, did you have glasses when you were a little kid? You must have been so cute. Did you have the big glasses? Oh my God, that's so cute.
I think I did.
Oh my God, little Asian girl with the big glasses. Oh my God, just pull them up while she talks.
And I was so tiny too. What was your question now?
How you got into the career you have now instead of being architect and writer? Yeah.
Right. I mean, I didn't even know that sex research existed. I went into neuroscience. I mean, I'm trying to remember what is it that took me away from architecture to science. For brain imaging technology just was so wild to me when I discovered that we had the ability to see what was happening in the brain semi in real time. I mean, fMRI, there's a bit of a delay when you're looking at brain activation, but it's basically real time. And I thought, this is amazing. And then I did a placement in sex research when I got into graduate school, and I thought, this is even more amazing. So that just ended up being the path I went down. But I did always want to write books eventually. So the fact that I got to do it at this stage is amazing. And I mean, you've done so many books, so we should have a conversation about this one day in terms of of comparing notes in terms of what the process is like and how you get inspired and everything.
I'm pretty promiscuous in terms of my subjects. So wait, are your parents like traditional Asian, like hard ass parents?
Very strict, yeah.
Okay, so how did you sit down? Is it Tiger Mom? Was that kind of the situation? How did you sit down Tiger Mom and say, Mom, I'm going to start talking about sex for my job? Like, I mean, was that a fun conversation to have?
I've always been like you said, I've always been dorky and I've always been weird. So my parents were not really weirded out by it. They're just like, okay. I mean, we're just happy that she's going to have a career to some extent, right? Like, it could be worse.
Do you have any siblings?
I don't like to. I don't like to talk too much about
Oh,
my
I'm sorry.
personal.
Okay,
No, it's okay. Just because activists can be crazy.
Oh,
So
you're right.
just
You're
to
right. I'm sorry.
protect.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry. I'm not trying to pry.
that's okay.
I thought it's just a fun
No, I know. I
topic to
know. I wish
imagine.
I could. I would love to, but it's
I
just
got you. I
unfortunately the
totally
world I'm
get
in.
it. I totally get it. I think I and even people in my position who take certain controversial perspectives and certain issues, I sometimes forget how fortunate I am that I don't have to deal with some of the harsher consequences for what could come of it. And I know you've had to deal with things like that. So I completely appreciate perspective. And I was not trying to cross a line, and it was silly of
Oh,
me
I know.
to go there. Let's talk about something fun. How bad is Canada right now? Like, are you allowed to leave your house?
Oh man, yeah, I mean, we have a passport mandate, or yeah, we have a mandate for non-essential, for basically like large areas and indoor dining and things like that. I mean, I could technically travel, but there's so many hoops to go through at this point. It's just such a mess. So this whole everything that's happened in the last 2 years, I just, what worries me the most is the authoritarian aspect. I know this is something you talk quite a bit about,
Of
just that
course.
it's scary to me to see the way people behave and this mob mentality about certain things and the lack of critical thinking. And also, I guess I'm surprised to see the people who have been upset at me for the things I've said. But I also realize, I mean, I think my job as a columnist and as a political commentator is to say what I think. It's
Yeah.
not to say things that please people. So when people get upset at me because they love what I say about gender, but they're upset that I'm critical about certain aspects of this narrative, I think, well, I appreciate your support, but my audience, I'm trying to attract people who just want to understand the truth and to pursue interesting questions and not be afraid to ask questions. And so if it upsets you that I'm questioning things, this is my job. So I'm not sure what to tell you. I understand that it's an emotional topic for a lot of people. I mean, I do think that the pandemic is serious. We should take it seriously. But there's a lot of stuff that's been happening that I find very worrisome.
How do you, between the pandemic and the seriousness of the topics you cover and dealing with people who are dealing often with, extreme mental situations? I know we've talked about this a little bit, but personally, how do you kind of focus on maintaining good mental health? It's very hard to have that arm's length perspective on ourselves.
Yeah, that's very important. I do really prioritize mental health, both for myself and my loved ones. And I would say for anybody listening, it's so important. And especially, I would say at the start of the pandemic when we went to lockdown. I mean, for me, I was in the process of, I just finished writing a book. So that in itself, I'm not sure if it's like that for you, but that to me is basically like a lockdown.
Well, for me, it's postpartum. Did you have postpartum when you finished your book?
No. Did you?
Really? Every time I
Yeah.
finish a book, maybe this could be, I'm not joking, this could be a male brain, female brain difference, because women tend to, by which I mean every woman is better than every man. Women tend to be better at multitasking than men do. So when I'm writing a book, this is the only focus in my psyche. And when that focus is taken away, it's kind of like, I don't know, like shoving me off a cliff. I don't know what I'm focused on anymore. And I'm in free fall, and it really does a number on me. That's lessened now because I've got the podcast. I have my garbage on Twitter and all this other stuff. But when I was only doing books, it really was extremely difficult. And it took me a long time to understand that this is somewhat common and is pretty much a similar phenomenon to postpartum.
Wow. Would you find that before you were writing books, would you find that with other projects you were working on in the same way, like if you get really interested in something and then it finishes, there's a pause there?
Yeah, because for me, my work is a large part of my identity. So if I'm not I'm not going towards some goal at the moment, then who am I? And like, what's the point? And it's very dark. And now that I know that it's there, it's a much less of an issue. But so that's interesting that you didn't have the same phenomenon when you finished your book.
No, but I think that's great too. Like you have great self-awareness in that you recognize it so that you know to also anticipate it. The next book, you're writing the white pill right now. Is that right?
It's great. It's very, very hard because when you're writing about like children being tortured and driven to suicide and like things that they did to them, there was a lot of tears. because, you know, as an author, as I'm sure you know, you're reading source material and then you kind of have to empathize with the characters who are real people. And then you have to translate in a way that was palatable, that anyone can understand. And I guess it's somewhat similar to being an actor, right? You're putting yourself in this person's shoes, but instead of being performative verbally and physically, you're doing it literally. And, you know, when you hear about, you know, children being slaughtered and people in the West saying this is a good thing, we need to import it here, and none of these people have ever been held accountable, it really does a number on you. You know, this one story, I think I may have even told you on your show, there was a concentration camp for kids up through the 80s in East Germany. And, you know, all the staff were largely staffed by like sexual predators because they knew that's where the victims were. And this one kid who was like 15 was like, hey, how about I kill myself? And we'll make a distraction. The rest of you can make a getaway. And this is like 1986. So, you know, in Berlin, like near Berlin. So when you know that this is like yesterday and across the street and like still no one cares, it's really, really tough. And it's like, why am I the only one who cares about this? This is just an abomination of abominations that no one should, you know, be indifferent to.
It's so sad. And I remember when I was doing a deep dive into detransitioners and their stories, that was probably when I was writing my book, that was probably the most emotionally difficult part for me, to realize that this is happening right now. And these young people are basically being completely ignored and treated.
Oh, yeah.
Not only that, they're being attacked by people and told that they're bad people. But I would definitely say, just more broadly, when it comes to dealing with mental health, just social support is very, very important. To always, you know, even if you feel like you can manage it yourself, sometimes it's okay just to reach out to people. And so for me, that was definitely when I was in that. Many of my friends will tell you, I mean, if they could talk about this, that that was a difficult part for me. But yeah, in terms of just mental health more broadly, exercise is really important. And I know that, so my point with lockdown was just, I know it was really difficult for a lot of people. And I feel very lucky in that I've been really healthy. But I think part of it is coming from a background in mental health, and also being aware that you have to prioritize sleeping and eating well, exercising, being around positive people. That's a huge thing. I think people can really underestimate the amount of influence that the people around you have in terms of the way you think and how you feel. That's huge.
And there's a lot, this is when you're young, you're just, everyone who's amiable and you have shared interests, you tend to be friends with them. And when you get older, sometimes people never learn this, but it's very important that there are people who are extremely negative, who are driven by negativity. And it is very important for them to pass that negativity onto you, because if there's positivity, their worldview implodes. So to validate their perspective, they really need everyone around them to be as miserable as them. And it's important to be able to identify these toxic people. And there's a term in recovery where it says, you can't make them sane, but they can make you crazy. So it's really important to have people who are around you who are supportive and understanding, and not just there to pull out the rug from under you because that's their worldview, because that's the kiss of death.
And today too, I mean, I am a huge supporter of people going and speaking to a professional if that's something they struggle with. I really feel in today's day and age, there's no reason. And I think it's really good that therapy is being destigmatized, and talking about mental health is destigmatized. So there's no reason, if you're struggling with something. I mean, it can be scary, the thought of going and talking to someone about it, but the alternative, I mean, for people who are extremely negative, in many cases, like you're saying, there's a part of them that enjoys it, or they want to stay that way because it's comfortable, but it's ultimately up to you what's good for you in terms of the people you have around you also.
Dr. Soh, we're running out of time. What has been your favorite part of this interview?
My favorite part was getting to catch up with you, and also the fact that your questions were so unique. I really appreciate that, because I know that you know, that's hard work.
You are welcome.